There is a white crystal sitting in your kitchen right now that you probably paid less than $1 for. And that same crystal has funded empires, financed wars, built the wealth of ancient kingdoms, and pushed a 60-year-old lawyer to walk 240 miles to the edge of the sea just to pick up a single illegal handful of it. It has caused smugglers to be sent to the gallows. It has been quietly blamed, at least in part, for helping trigger one of the most violent revolutions in European history. And for most of human existence, getting enough of it wasn't a seasoning choice. It was the difference between surviving the winter and not. So what is it about this one ordinary substance that made it worth so much for so long to so many people? Let's find out. To understand why salt mattered so much, you first have to understand what life was like without a refrigerator. For nearly all of human history, that was simply reality. If you caught more fish than your family could eat in a day, or slaughtered an animal too large to finish before it spoiled, you had a serious problem because bacteria doesn't wait. Meat and fish left untreated in open air begins to rot within days, sometimes hours in warm climates. And for thousands of years, humanity had exactly one truly reliable way to stop that process: salt. When salt is packed into meat or fish, it draws the moisture out of the tissue. And without that moisture, the bacteria that cause decay simply can't survive. It sounds almost too simple to have shaped human civilization. But that simple chemical fact meant that any group of people who could reliably produce or acquire salt could store food for winter, provision an army for a long campaign, or preserve a catch of fish long enough to trade it hundreds of miles inland. Salt wasn't a luxury, it was survival technology. The earliest confirmed evidence of humans deliberately producing salt comes from a site called Poiana Slatini in what is now Romania, where archaeologists have found the remains of fire pits and specialized ceramic vessels used to boil concentrated brine from a natural salt spring dating back to roughly 6000 BC. That means people were already engineering a process, building fires, evaporating water, collecting crystals, specifically to produce salt thousands of years before anyone in that region was working with metal and long before writing existed anywhere on Earth. Salt production, in other words, may be one of the very first organized industries in human history. As civilizations grew larger and more complex, so did the value of controlling salt. Ancient Rome understood this perfectly. The empire built an entire road, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, specifically to move this precious mineral from coastal salt pans deep into the heart of Roman territory. Salt was so tightly woven into Roman military and civic life that its Latin name, sal, worked its way permanently into the language itself. Roman soldiers received an allowance connected to salt called a salarium, and centuries later, that Latin word would evolve almost unchanged into the modern English word we use every single payday: salary. Powers and ideas. Now here's where popular history and actual history start to pull apart, and it's worth pausing on because it's one of the most widely repeated claims about salt in the entire historical record. You've probably heard some version of this. Roman soldiers, the story goes, were literally paid in blocks of salt instead of coins, which is supposedly where we get the phrase "worth his salt." It's a fantastic story. It shows up in documentaries, textbooks, trivia nights, and thousands of articles online. World's in a hurry just to be let down. We're it also isn't true. When historians and classicists have gone back through the surviving Roman sources looking for actual evidence of soldiers being handed salt as payment, they've found essentially nothing. No pay records, no military accounts, no first-hand testimony describing it. The one ancient writer occasionally cited to support the claim, Pliny the Elder, doesn't actually say soldiers were paid in salt at all. The most likely explanation researchers have identified is that the myth took shape centuries later, sometime around the late 1700s, when an Italian dictionary misinterpreted the connection between the word salarium and the word sal, and that misreading simply stuck, repeated so often over the following 2 centuries that it hardened into something that felt like established fact. The real story is a little less dramatic, but arguably more interesting. Salarium most likely referred to a monetary allowance specifically intended for purchasing salt, not a payment made directly in the mineral itself. Salt didn't need to be handed out as literal currency to be treated as something worth building an entire word around. Its value was already that deeply embedded in Roman life. If salt could shape the vocabulary of an empire, in West Africa, it helped build entire kingdoms outright. South of the Sahara Desert, in the region historians now call the Western Sudan, there was almost no natural salt to be found anywhere. But hundreds of miles north, deep within the Sahara itself, there were massive deposits of it, mined in punishing desert conditions and cut into heavy slabs. At the same time, the forests and river valleys south of the desert were sitting on some of the richest gold deposits in the ancient world. 2 regions, each desperately wanting exactly what the other one had in abundance. The solution was one of the most demanding trade networks ever organized before the modern era. Camel caravans, sometimes stretching to include thousands of animals, crossed roughly 1,000 miles of open desert, carrying massive slabs of salt southward to trading cities like Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao. There, that salt was exchanged, often through a highly ritualized, largely silent form of bartering, for gold dust mined further south. In some of the most salt-starved regions along this route, a slab of salt could genuinely become worth close to its own weight in gold. A detail so striking that variations of it have been repeated by writers for centuries, though the exact exchange rate shifted constantly, depending on distance, season, and local supply. This trade didn't just move goods, it built empires. The wealth generated by controlling these salt and gold routes helped finance the rise of Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai, 3 of the most powerful and sophisticated kingdoms in African history. When the Malian emperor Mansa Musa made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in the 1320s, he reportedly traveled with so much gold drawn directly from this trade network that his spending along the route caused the price of gold in Cairo to crash for years afterward. An entire empire's reputation for staggering wealth traced back, in significant part, to camel caravans hauling slabs of salt across open desert. If any of this is surprising you so far, now's a good moment to hit subscribe, because what happens next when European monarchies figure out how to turn ordinary people's need for salt into one of the most hated taxes in history is where this story turns from fascinating into genuinely explosive. In medieval France, the crown looked at how essential salt was to every single household, for cooking, for preserving meat, for making cheese, for keeping livestock alive through winter, and saw not a resource to protect, but a resource to tax. Starting in the 1300s, the French monarchy established what became known as the gabelle, a mandatory salt tax that eventually required nearly every citizen over the age of 8 to purchase a fixed minimum amount of salt each year at a price set entirely by the crown. What made the gabelle especially hated wasn't just its existence, it was its staggering unfairness. Depending on which region of France you lived in, the price of legally mandated salt could be 10 times higher than in a neighboring province. Nobility and clergy were largely exempt from paying it at all. Meanwhile, ordinary families already struggling were legally required to buy salt they often couldn't afford from a monopoly they had no power to negotiate with. Unsurprisingly, a massive underground network of salt smugglers known as the faux sauniers emerged to move cheaper salt into overtaxed regions. Getting caught could mean years in prison, forced labor on the king's ships, or in some cases, execution. By the late 1700s, the gabelle had become one of the most frequently cited grievances in the formal lists of complaints drawn up by ordinary French citizens on the eve of revolution. It wasn't the only cause, of course. Revolutions are never that simple, but it stood as one of the clearest, most personally felt symbols of everything people despised about a monarchy that taxed their most basic necessities while exempting itself. When the French Revolution finally erupted and the old order began to collapse, one of the very first acts of the new National Assembly in March of 1790 was to formally abolish the gabelle entirely. A tax on salt had become quite literally one of the sparks that helped burn down a monarchy. Nearly 140 years later, on the other side of the world, salt would once again become the flashpoint for revolution, though this time the method looked almost nothing like violence at all. By 1930, the British colonial government controlled India's salt production through a strict legal monopoly. Indians were forbidden by law to produce or sell their own salt, even though it occurred naturally along thousands of miles of Indian coastline, and were instead required to buy it from the British at a price that included a significant tax, a tax that weighed most heavily on India's poorest citizens, the very people who could least afford it.
Mahatma Gandhi, already a central figure in India's independence movement, chose this specific law as the target for a new campaign of non-violent resistance. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out on foot from his religious retreat near Ahmedabad, accompanied by just 78 followers, on a march toward the coastal village of Dandi, roughly 240 miles away. As word spread along the route, the march grew. Crowds gathered in every town to hear him speak. International journalists began covering his progress. By the time he reached the sea, 24 days later, the world was watching. On the morning of April 6, 1930, Gandhi walked into the surf, then bent down and picked up a small lump of natural salt from the mud. It was technically a criminal act, and it was deliberately powerfully simple, an act almost anyone could understand and repeat, regardless of literacy, wealth, or status. Word of what he'd done spread rapidly across India, and in the following weeks, tens of thousands of Indians followed his example, making or buying illegal salt in open defiance of British law. The British response was swift and heavy-handed. By the end of that year, roughly 60,000 people had been arrested. But the Salt March had already accomplished something the British couldn't arrest their way out of. It had shown unmistakably, both to India and to the watching world, the scale and determination of a non-violent movement demanding independence. A movement that would continue building for nearly 2 more decades until India finally achieved that independence in 1947. So, here's where all of this leaves us. A mineral that early humans learned to extract from boiling spring water thousands of years before writing existed. A resource valuable enough that Rome built roads for it, and possibly, though not quite in the way legend remembers, shaped the very word we use for our paychecks. A commodity so precious in parts of West Africa that it helped fund empires wealthy enough to crash international gold markets. A tax so despised in France that abolishing it was one of the revolution's first acts. And a British monopoly so resented in India that breaking it through nothing more dramatic than picking up a handful of mud and salt water helped ignite the final chapter of a colonial empire's collapse. What connects every single one of these stories isn't really salt itself. It's what happens when something ordinary people cannot live without ends up controlled by someone else. Time and time again, across wildly different centuries and continents, that specific arrangement, essential resource, controlled by a distant, self-interested authority, has proven to be one of the most reliably explosive combinations in human history. Today, salt is so abundant, so cheap, so thoroughly unremarkable that most of us will go our entire lives without spending more than a few minutes thinking about where it actually comes from. It sits in a plastic container in your cupboard, and it costs almost anything else you'll buy this week. Which makes it worth asking, the next time you casually sprinkle some over your dinner, what else in your daily life feels exactly that unremarkable right now that future generations might look back on as something people once seriously fought and died and marched 240 miles for? If this is the kind of history you want more of, the most useful thing you can do is drop a comment telling me what forgotten story deserves this treatment next. Hit like if this changed how you'll think about your salt shaker, and subscribe so the next one finds you the moment it's out.